Here's Michael Knowles to give some obtuse responses to TikTok atheists.
We have no guest. We have no explanations. We're on the brink of Armageddon, according to some people. We've got red heifers in Israel.
Do we really? And do you actually believe in that red heifer nonsense?
All we have for Theology Thursday is some video. Take it away.
God almost certainly does not exist. But if it does, and it is all-knowing, meaning it knows everything that ever was...
Put a pause here. These libs insist that I respect everybody's preferred pronouns. Even the biggest, hairiest, hulking dude, even if he's wearing men's clothing, he doesn't even need to be wearing a dress. If he says, I'm a woman.
Excuse me, it's ma'am.
It is ma'am.
These libs tell me I am obligated to call him she and her. And yet, when God very clearly describes his preferred pronouns, he and him, this guy refuses to accept them, and he depersonalizes God and refers to God disrespectfully as it.
Where exactly does God specify any preferred pronouns? Also, why would someone who thinks that pronouns ought to reflect a person's reproductive system insist that we refer to the Father or the Holy Spirit, who have no reproductive systems at all, by pronouns that they insist are only for people who have inseminational reproductive systems?
Keep going.
Meaning it knows everything that ever was, is, and ever will be, then it is responsible for all of the evil in the universe. Don't worry. I'll explain.
No.
So if you believe God exists, that means that you believe in a time where humans did not exist because God had not yet created us. At that point in time, an all-knowing God would know for a fact that if it did create humans, they would be evil. Evil in air quotes because morality is actually subjective, but it knew that they would be awful to their planet, awful to other species.
Put a pause here. Wow, I love the clearest example of human evil is littering.
Yeah, being awful to the planet is nothing more than littering. I'm sure that's what he meant.
It's pollution. He doesn't say, the murder and the genocide and the cruelty and the betrayal. No. It's the littering that's the bad thing.
Michael would apparently like us to believe that pollution has never harmed anyone at all.
He obviously has some confused premises here. Even to begin, think about the epistemological pride that one must have to think, I, some guy in the year of our Lord 2024, I've just discovered the flaw with religion, which is that bad things happen to good people. I've just discovered the flaw with religion, which is that there is such a thing as evil in the world.
I guess I missed the part when the guy in the TikTok claimed to have discovered a brand new proof of God's non-existence. Yeah, this is an old problem. That doesn't mean it's been adequately dealt with by apologists. It hasn't.
Yeah, oh, wow. Wow, man, that never occurred to me. That never occurred to any of the theologians for all of history, for all of the men who actually dedicated their lives to studying this and who were deeply faithful and shaped the faith. This never occurred to the author of the book of Job, for instance, or the author of the book of Genesis, for that matter. It's never occurred to anybody, right?
Yeah, it occurred to them, and for thousands of years, they still haven't come up with an explanation that makes any sense. The answer that the author of Job gives is to essentially tell everyone who brings up the issue, well, who the f*** do you think you are to question God? That's not really an explanation now, is it? And the explanation in Genesis is that because two people disobeyed God, we are now all evil for some reason. The explanation is more confusing than the problem it supposedly addresses.
If I'm this guy, and it occurs, I say, God is supposedly all good and all powerful and all knowing, and yet there is evil in the world. Well, what does that mean?
It means that the idea that there's a God which is both all good and all powerful is contradicted by observable reality.
Statistically, all the intelligent people ever have believed in God.
I guess Stephen Hawking was not among the intelligent people.
And so is it possible that I am wrong, that I am missing something? No, it is the children who are out of touch.
Prove me wrong, kids.
Awful to other species on their planet. Awful to their own species, and arguably most importantly, awful to God, because they would break its precious little nonsensical rules. But God still...
Put a pause here. Nonsensical rules. That's interesting. Thou shalt not commit murder. Would you say that's a nonsensical rule?
That's a rule that I would make myself, but the graven images one is pretty nonsensical.
Probably not, probably. If this guy's saying there's all this evil, there are all these bad things that we do, well, then you're acknowledging there are rules and that the rules are sensible, that the rules are logical. So all of a sudden, the God that you were demeaning or attempting to demean as nonsensical and illogical, you're acknowledging is logical, has quite a lot of sense, infinite sense, you might say. So which is it?
He's acknowledging that God is alleged to have made rules, but not that they're all sensible. I can acknowledge that there is evil in the world as God allegedly defines evil, but that doesn't mean that I believe that what God supposedly says is evil really is. I acknowledge that the rule against graven images exists, and that people break it, but that in no way is an acknowledgement that it is a rule that makes sense.
Here's an example to consider. If you knew, not guessed, not hypothesized, not assumed, but you knew undoubtedly, assuredly, 100% for a fact that if you had a child, that child would grow up to be a mass unaliver, and you still decided to have that child, you would be a terrible person.
You wouldn't be. I mean, he's confusing so many things. Even going back further, he says that humans are, sort of uniformly evil. That's not true.
So we're not all sinners in the eyes of God?
He then says, if you knew somehow in advance that your baby were going to grow up to be a mass murderer, you would be a bad person if you didn't murder your baby.
That's not what he said. What he said was, if you had a child, not if you carried a child to term. I suspect what he means is that if you knew before you ever even conceived a child that your child would end up unaliving a bunch of people, then it would be bad to conceive that child. I think he's using this as an analogy for God, who made us while having full knowledge of what we would do. He could have made only people that he knew would never disobey him, but instead he made people that he knew would disobey him and that he would end up punishing. Why is that better than just abstaining from making those people in the first place? Sometimes apologists will say that without evil, we couldn't have good things like redemption and healing. I'm curious as to how many of those apologists ever thought, gee, I sure do wish I had an injury to heal from. That would be so much better than not being injured in the first place.
That's taking a lot of assumptions in. That's assuming a consequentialist kind of ethics, a utilitarian style ethics.
It's consequentialist, but it isn't necessarily utilitarian. Utilitarianism aims at the greatest good for the greatest number. If this dude is saying that God should only have made the people he knew would never sin, he's not advocating that God maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. He's advocating the greatest good for what would probably end up being a tiny minority of all of the people who could possibly be born.
Which I think would be unfounded, because you'd be committing, which I think this guy already admitted, implicitly or explicitly.
There are ways to avoid having a child that don't involve terminating a pregnancy, if that's what you mean. It seems pretty clear to me that he meant that you should abstain from conceiving children if you infallibly know that those kids will end up harming people.
Is wrong, right? At least implicitly, he's admitting that murder is wrong. So you would be a very bad person if you did murder your baby. Lots of ethical confusion here in this guy's diatribe.
Even if what this guy had in mind was terminating a pregnancy of a fetus that he knew would grow up to unalive a bunch of people, it's odd for a conservative to consider that immoral given their support for stand-your-ground laws. And why did God order the mass unaliving of Canaanite and Amalekite children if it wasn't because he thought they would grow up to be evil?
So, since God knew it was bringing evil into the universe, and it decided to do it anyway, God is evil.
Is that eye roll supposed to be an argument?
Oh, and if you think the free will excuse gets God out of this one, you're wrong, because free will is incompatible with an all-knowing God. If God is omniscient, then it knows how we're going
to... Put a pause here. It's just, the only thing that's really astounding about this video is the pride. I guess I don't peruse Reddit nearly enough, because this type of Reddit tier atheism, I sort of forgot existed. It's one thing to be an atheist. You just can't get yourself to believe in God. I think that speaks to an intellectual and certainly a spiritual defect. To offer these kinds of arguments, what that reveals is not just that you don't believe in God. It reveals that you've never even really taken the question seriously, because you've never read any of the people who can explain these answers to you.
I've been reading and responding to the rebuttals to these challenges literally since Michael Knowles was in grade school. And the more of them I read, the more of them I hear, the weaker I can see that they are.
You're making arguments that are so dumb at a very elemental level that even the prominent atheists wouldn't make them.
Lots of the prominent atheists have pointed out the problem of evil. Hitchens and Dawkins have both referenced the argument.
What this man is expressing here is not, I don't believe in God. I've grappled with the question and I don't believe in God. He's saying, I haven't even cracked the spine of a book to begin investigating this. Keep going.
If God is omniscient, then it knows how we're going to act in advance. Everything that we do has to align with God's foreknowledge, meaning that our free will is actually just an illusion. Either God is all-knowing or we have free will. Both cannot simultaneously be true, and this argument supposes the former over the latter.
So put a pause here. God is outside of time and space, except when he enters into time and space.
Which is a contradiction. Time and space are the boundaries of existence itself. It is a contradiction to say that anything is outside of time and space. To say that is effectively to say that God exists outside of existence. It's incoherent.
And so God being outside of time and space and being all-knowing would not contradict man, who is within time and space, having free will.
Yes, it would. To say that there is a frame of reference from which all events have already happened, or from which all events are simultaneous, is to say that every event in the future is no more alterable than events in the past. Am I free to do anything that is contrary to what God knows that I will do? If God knows the future infallibly, then the answer can only coherently be no. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.